What a privilege. I'm Diane Flynn, and I'm the CMO here at GSVlabs. And I'm just delighted to be able to sit on stage with the likes of you. This is going to be great to hear some of your wisdom. We have people here tonight who, and this past 2 days, who've come from all over the world. I've talked to several who have never been to Silicon Valley. So I would like to hear, they would all like to hear from you about the magic of Silicon Valley. What is it, and do you think it's changed? Anyone can dive in.
I'd say anything's possible. I moved out here in '83, and growing up on a farm in Wisconsin, I could never understand once I got here why my ancestors didn't keep going. It was just honestly smart people willing to try anything, working with John at Sun, and it was just such a hot place that you just felt no restrictions. And I think that continues. We've had our ups and downs, both culturally perhaps, and perhaps a touch of arrogance every few cycles, and we certainly have had a lot of cycles, but that makes us all stronger.
You know, I was fortunate enough to start my career here at HP in the tail end of Bill Hewlett and Dave Packer's background. And when HP, you know, had this idea in those days where I learned the importance of the individual, and every individual, no matter what job they had or what level you had, would be treated with respect. And so what part of the magic here to me is about the understanding of how important people are in whatever you're trying to do. Then the other thing, at HP had this concept of the next big bench syndrome, which I'm sure none of you young people ever heard, but solving a problem that you understood that somebody next to you would make their life or their work better. And I think that's part of the innovation ethos here in the Valley.
Before I was a lawyer, I was an engineer, briefly, an engineering student. And every single engineering class at Stanford University began with the story of Hewlett-Packard and how Dave and Bill in their garage built the oscillators that Walt Disney bought to do the sound in Fantasia. So every single engineering student that graduates from Stanford has that magic vision built into them. And I think the key, I also grew up in Boston, where I always have compared the Boston area to Silicon Valley. And the ingredients of Silicon Valley are clearly, you know, the educational institutions, the good weather, but I think the key is the role models. The role models, like the founders of Hewlett-Packard, the founders of all of the companies that have been mentioned this evening, the two wonderful people to my left, and you don't see that in other would-be tech centers in the United States, that there are people with just an idea created a multi-million, multi-billion-dollar company. It just doesn't happen anywhere, and I think there's a magnetism that draws people like Carol I met Carol in 1983, actually, and that brings people here that have that same indomitable spirit.
We hear a lot and talk a lot about the global Silicon Valley. Do you see these leaders popping up elsewhere that we didn't perhaps see decades ago?
Yeah, I do actually. In our practice, we've seen incredible innovation and company building in China. Mm-hmm. And there's a strong interaction between Silicon Valley and China. And for a long while, China was a manufacturing company or a company, and kind of a me too, but there's real innovation going on at scale in China, and the same kind of entrepreneurial spirit pervades the companies there and the young people, many of whom come to study here in return, and you know, there's a whole innovation center and city called Hangzhou, which this could only happen in China. It was conceived, or it was there a year ago, so this is all a year old. It was conceived 9 months earlier, and about a dozen buildings were complete. On the day I walked in across the still drying concrete steps. But it's a complete innovation center right near the Zhejiang University. It's just, it sprung up overnight.
Wow. So let's talk a little bit about your leadership. Carol, when you were at Autodesk, revenues rose from 300 million to 1.5 billion in about 15 years. So that's
Sounds pretty slow to me. It wasn't back then.
well, that's the 5 times increase. Sounds pretty good to me. What would you attribute this remarkable success to, and what were some of the profound challenges of that kind of rapid growth?
Well, the success was everybody in the company. But I got to Autodesk. There was a company that was 10 years old, had one product. And one product that was pretty ill-defined. One of my first things I did is I went to visit architects and said, what do you think of AutoCAD? And they said, well, it's great, but it's for the engineer. I visit the engineers, and they said, it's great, but it's for the architect. So nobody knew who the heck the product was for. But they were all using it because it was a tool. And so basically, in the 14 years or so I was there, I had to turn the company around 3 times. You forget sometimes. You always think you're only turning a company around. The turnover guy comes in and turns it around, and off they go into the sunset. But companies change, and the industry changes. And so we were a DOS-based, command line, list-based APIs, had to get to Windows, only released software every 2 years. Every 2 years. The biggest thing you did in marketing was add another number to the release. Release 12, release 13, release 14. And then you figured out what the box looked like. And then the internet hit us. And of course, everybody assumed, my employees for sure, that real engineers and technical people would never use the internet because it wasn't secure enough, important enough, blah, blah, blah. And so, but what I am most proud of is my slogan at Autodesk is, if God didn't make it, one of my customers did. And that's very profound. And that is back to why the company was successful, is because the people that worked there actually believed in that, the physicality of what our customers did in the world.
Great. Gordy, what are some of the challenges startups face with new business models for which the legal regime is not adapted, like regulation of ride sharing, autonomous cars, electronic payments? The list goes on.
This is actually what makes lawyering fun in Silicon Valley. You know, when I was in law school, I used to dread, please don't let me be a banking lawyer and be reviewing truth in lending forms or something. So we're asked to solve novel problems, and the law just can't keep up with innovation and the kinds of things that go on in Silicon Valley. And I had the privilege of joining an entrepreneurial law firm. Our founder, Bill Fenwick, is here. In the early days, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak walked in the door, and one of the greatest bits of lawyering that I've ever witnessed was Bill Fenwick, where the first question asked was, how do we protect our software in a world where everybody's going to buy a personal computer? And to that point, there were software licenses that were 30 pages long and heavily negotiated, and lawyers were involved, and it took months to negotiate. And I believe that Bill invented what was then the shrink wrap license, and now we know it as a click wrap license, and you know, we click through those probably without reading them, but because the copyright law was written in 1909. In 1976, Congress revised it, and in 1976, of course, is when Apple was born. So and there was a specific section of the Copyright Act that was to address the copyrightability of computer software, and Congress decided not to decide. It said whatever the protection in 1909 was of software, it still is. And Bill said we have to presume that copyright protection will eventually apply. And in 1980, the Congress fixed that and declared it. But in the meantime, the industry had adopted shrink-wrap licensing. So an early example of the law isn't ready for innovation. So the whole gig economy and ride sharing and room sharing and so forth, the laws just weren't made, didn't understand that context. And the laws are adapting, the companies are adapting their business models, and we're coming to a workable solution for all of those.
You bring up Apple. I heard a story about you working with Steve in the early days, and I guess you had the opportunity to either get a $7,000 fee or some stock, and I think you chose the fee. And that stock about 15 years ago was worth like 70 million. Was it, any advice or thoughts from
The story is directionally correct. Bill and I disagree
Mike
on
told me the story.
Bill and I disagree on the numbers involved, but it probably was a fee of more like $500 and maybe a foregone capital gain of a few million. But yeah, we made that mistake. We made that mistake.
On that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk a moment about diversity. Carol and Ken, you both have been pioneers and have really paved the way for many of us. Ken, America today is a nation of 320 million people, roughly 70% white, 15% Hispanic, 11% African American, and 4% Asian. Someday soon, you've stated that the country's technology workforce can and should break down along similar lines compared to the current 2% of African American and Hispanics in tech. How do we create a more welcoming, inclusive environment for people of color in the technology world?
Well, if I really knew that, wouldn't be sitting here.
We need ideas.
But I just have some things I believe to be true, and I think it comes together. So, one is that social systems want to recreate themselves. And so if you have a company of all white males or all white females or all black males, whatever it is, you will tend naturally to want to create yourself. So that's one, if you believe that. The second thing is that I believe that the most important thing in the technology business is talent. And you win and lose by talent. And if you believe that, then you should leave no rock uncovered to find talent. And if you don't do that, you're defeating the purpose of the enterprise. You won't be as successful. The problem is that no matter what people say, especially as you grow a company, the average manager does not want to maximize potential, he wants to minimize risk. I don't want to fail. And so if you say I don't want to fail, then difference creates risk that I'm uncomfortable with. And the challenge for an organization is how do I confront that risk of saying, because you're different than me, that I think is more risk. I'll tell you a recent story. I had a meeting, it was on a Saturday, with 3 investment bankers from New York. Okay, this is Saturday. They all had on, black jackets and white shirts, but no tie because they're in Silicon Valley, all right?
I'm surprised they had jackets.
All right. And so in meetings, I always start a meeting by saying, tell me who you are and your background. Blah, 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 Harvard Law. Blah, 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 Harvard Law. The third guy was embarrassed because they were all the same, And my last comment, I believe, is that if we have different points of view to solve a complex problem, there's a higher probability of a positive creative outcome if we come at the problem differently. I can tell you definitely growing up as a male is different than growing up as a female. So my wife looks at things very differently than I do often. And I can tell you for sure as a black male, growing up is different than growing up as a white male. And so I think the idea of diversity is just common sense. If we can confront the fear of failure because difference creates risk.
Right. We had John Donahoe speaking earlier today, chairman of PayPal, and the question to him was, what would life have been like if you had been Jane Donahoe? And he said it would have been a lot harder. He said, you know, there were a lot of advantages. So Carol, let's talk about being a woman pioneer. I know in school you loved math. At college you said you were one of 2 females computer science majors back in the 70s, right?
That would be correct.
I'm not far behind.
Punch, paper, tape. Moved on to cards.
And then you've worked in tech all your life. As a trailblazing woman, tell us about your experience along the way and what you think has changed for women in tech in the past 30 years.
First of all, I want to answer the last question.
Great.
And then I'll answer this question. I used to think that the problem with diversity is the world was run by old white men. And old white men choose medium old white men. And on it goes. I'm no longer quite so sure about that, and I'm no longer quite so optimistic. Because I had this idea that when the young men who grew up with my daughter and who came up through the system with women in college with them and so forth would accept their status, would accept that they were smart, that they were capable, they could be athletic, they could be anything they wanted to be. But instead, some kind of frat boy shit showed up, which is, And I think we have a label problem now, Ken. I think it's too easy to slap a label on anybody, and whether it's out of the lack of feeling it's they're part of your tribe or whatever it is, but I don't feel nearly as good as I did even 10, 15 years ago, as far as things are getting better. Diversity. I mean, anytime you're not in control, you are a minority. And some minorities face worse issues than others. There's no doubt about it. But you are not in control. So what was it being? Listen, when I graduated in 1971 with a computer science degree, I was really damn lucky because there weren't many people that had computer science degrees, so they couldn't afford to figure out that I was a farm girl from Wisconsin. I mean, it's like, whoa, you have a computer science degree. Wow. And in fact, to get hired on as a salesperson of digital equipment, you had to be a double E or a CS. And so I was the second woman ever hired. So I spent a lot of my life being the only this, the only that, and it wasn't much fun. It wasn't much fun being thrown in the corner and somebody tried to grapple you, and any of that wasn't much fun. But it was such a thrilling time. Such thrilling things were happening that you just put up with it. And you didn't actually know you couldn't, that you had a choice not to put up with it. In fact, you didn't have a choice not to put up with it. I mean, hit the road. If I was fired on my first day at work at 3M. Now, even those people that know me know that might be impossible. I mean, I'd make it to the first week, wouldn't I, Gordy?
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. My first day at 3M literally was on a plane flying to a conference in Washington, D.C., where I found out I was rooming with a man because you all roomed together back then. So it was C. Bartz and S. Jones, and so C. Bartz and S. Jones were rooming together. Well, that wasn't going to work. And then the next thing, I wake up the next morning and find out that the rumor was I'd slept with my boss, so they fired me.
Wow.
I didn't even know how the hell to get back to St. Paul. I mean, that was like my second airplane ride in my whole life. And so they're buzzing all around, all these management people buzzing all around trying to figure out what to do. And then they decided a couple hours later that, well, maybe they shouldn't fire me. They should figure something else out. Honest to God, and I stayed with that company for 5 years until I told them to go themselves. So anyway, you don't want to hear anymore because there's a lot. And I don't think it's much different today. Sorry.
That's sobering. So Gordy, Bill Campbell referred to you as his alter ego and his go-to guy on many matters. You're often perceived as much as a businessman as you are an attorney. And everyone talked, when we listened to all the people talk about your judgment, your moral compass, your sense of values. I'm curious, how did you gain the trust of the leaders of Silicon Valley, and what's your approach to advising CEOs, and what are some of the challenges?
It's a great question. One of the things I learned early on from watching my clients is that CEO is the loneliest job you can possibly have. And it's because you can never show weakness. You have to show strength to your employees, to your customers, to your board, to your shareholders, and there can never be a hint of self-doubt. And who then can you share your worries with? Who can you talk to? A group was formed, YPO, Young Presidents Organization, I think, to solve that problem. And I realized that CEOs really need somebody they can just bounce ideas off. So early on, I started a practice where I just have breakfast once a quarter with the CEOs of my clients, and without an agenda, without a legal topic, just what's on their mind. And they seemed to appreciate that, and they kept it up. And I learned a lot more about the companies and how CEOs think, and just listened. And then when it came time to give legal advice, I had context for what the business objectives were, and what the second and third order considerations were. So I think that's one of the ways that you can build a strong bond with a client. My clients become my friends that way. That's one thought. Another thought that occurs to me is, as I said, I was an engineer before I was a lawyer, and I don't think of legal problems as legal problems. I think of them as engineering problems that you just really kind of need to figure out what the logical answer is, what the right answer is, as opposed to looking it up in a book and giving the law as though that came from God, but trying to give practical advice within the law, and certainly not to break the law, but how to structure a transaction or test the law if it isn't keeping pace with technology. And so I think it's lawyers are at their best when they're problem solvers, and I think that's the important thing in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I think this CEO job is really difficult, and I like to say is talking to yourself is not particularly enlightening, and so having someone to talk to, and I just like to ask questions because often the CEO knows the answer, you just have trouble coming to that decision because that's hard, and you sit down and talk to a CEO and he walks through his or her management team. And you say, why is that person still working for you? Given what you just said to me, it makes no sense for that person to be in their job. It's just, so helping that person confront their own issues, because it's hard. Because you can't do that, the board is your boss. You know that. Everybody knows that. You can't be totally, it'll come back to haunt you. And so just being someone that you can be a listening ear and ask good questions.
Aside from hiring decisions, what are some of the patterns that CEOs face? That I know you do a lot of mentoring. Everyone we talked to described you as first and foremost a people person. Are there any patterns to the struggles?
Oh, yeah. Well, first, you have all these myths in your head, like, I want to have a stable organization. But you can't grow and be stable. All right, so okay. So you never get stability, and so that's a struggle. So you grow as fast as we did at SGI or Sun or any of these companies, Pinterest, is that you wake up and you thought you had it right, but it's wrong next year because the issues are different, the challenges are different. And so how do you struggle with the issue of confront what used to be a good decision? Now you got to overturn a good decision that you made, okay? Or you got somebody that was wonderful working for you last year. It no longer makes sense. How do you confront that? When everybody in the organization knows that person's in the wrong job. And so it's just really, really hard. And I find this ability to learn, this ability to be self-aware, to kind of know yourself, and to surround yourself around people who balance who you are and your strengths. It's just hard. It's a hard job. It's a reason why most people don't survive very long as a CEO. But when you get it right, it's cool, right, Carol?
Thank you.
So Carol, let's talk about failure and failing fast. You are credited with instituting and promoting Autodesk's 3F, or Fail Fast Forward concept. Failing fast and often is now a mantra for startups seeking rapid innovation here. Do you still believe this? And isn't it better to be wildly successful?
Well, I think you can only be wildly successful if you make some mistakes. And how do you know you're successful if you haven't made some mistakes? You wouldn't know what the downside, you wouldn't know what it was. It's like, how can you be happy if you've never been sad? So the reason I started this concept, again, I like sound bites for employees. In fact, my wonderful companion HR, Steve McMahon, said, you have to be so sick of saying it by the time an employee even understands what you're saying. You can't almost get it out of your mouth anymore. And so I had to institute Fail Fast Forward because people were so afraid of making change and making mistake. And so when you think of going from a 2-year development cycle to literally releasing software every month online, I mean, these people were petrified. And so the whole idea was, failing is fine, do it as quickly as you can figure it out, and hopefully you've learned enough to move even a half step forward. And just really trying to get that kind of change. Yes, people abuse it. Oh, I failed, aren't I wonderful I failed? It's like, get over it. I mean, you can turn any good thing into a bad thing if you just have that point of view. And so I think Silicon Valley is famous for what didn't work at the time and they fixed. They were famous for that. I mean, so a self-driving car crashes. Well, guess what? It's not going to crash in a few years. And people are going to be better off for it. So stop with the hand-wringing. Anyway, that's my point of view.
Ken and Gordy, any thoughts on
my
failure?
observation is you don't learn anything from success. You only learn something from failure. You say, I did that wrong, I made a mistake there, I'm not going to do it again. You have success, you say, boy, I'm smart. I'm really smart. I did that right. And then you think back and somebody asks you, what did you do right? And it's not clear. And probably you were really just lucky. And so we all know that one of the successes to an entrepreneurial company or culture is to be able to pivot fast when the rules change or the market changes. And you might have had the best solution to a problem that doesn't exist anymore. So the key in fail fast forward is the fast part. The object is obviously not failing. It's pivoting and figuring out what you can learn and what you can do better.
Diane, I want to add something. Over my career, I've had so many people come and say, I'm working for such a terrible boss, you got to do something, so on and so on. And the one thing I always said was, you will really learn how to be a better manager by working for a bad boss, because you will know what not to do. Because if you're working for such a wonderful manager, you don't even realize it. You don't even know what makes it wonderful. When you're working for somebody who's not so good, you say, I wouldn't berate somebody in front of other people. I wouldn't do this, I wouldn't do that. So I said, learn. Take the time to learn. Now, eventually, you'll need to move on, and chances are the boss will move on, but settle down and take this as the failure perhaps on your boss's part, or perhaps on your interaction, whatever it might be, but take that time to learn what you wouldn't do. And so use your idea of his failure as your plus. And you just have to get people to look at these things a little differently.
Carol, I've had this conversation with people about their bosses. I says, I'll guarantee you something. When you first become a manager, the people who work for you are going to say the same thing about you that you're saying about your boss. Being a manager of people is really hard.
Bill Campbell was honored last year and was a good friend of all of us. He used to say to his mentees, your title makes you a manager, but your people make you a leader. And you learn from your people, and if you inspire them and they inspire you, you can effectively lead them.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely right. Andreessen described you, Gordy, as the culture carrier of Silicon Valley. What values do you think are critical for building culture?
I saw that on the video. I'm not sure exactly what he means, especially since he began with the Robert Duvall character from The Godfather. So there's a certain culture there. But I guess he means that every one of our clients has a set of core values, and they all include something about innovation, failing fast, move fast, break things, listen to the customer, and so forth. But every one of them also includes essentially integrity without compromise. Intuit has that, for example. And I think that's part of what Mark probably meant, that as advisors to companies, as legal advisors, we try to be creative and solve problems and come to solutions, but there's a certain line legally that you won't cross, and I think there's also a line dealing with people that you won't cross. I mean, you're going to be honest with people, and do right by your customers is another core value most companies have in their set of core values.
I want to answer for Gordy, because I've worked with Gordy for years. Ken and I were doing our set jobs. You got to go around. I mean, now you can be a mentor and whatever, but when you were heads down at Silicon Graphics, you only mentored Silicon Graphics. You didn't necessarily. You get to go around and see all the companies. And you, because of your personality, get to gently let us know when we maybe are outside the boundary of what happens around here. And I think that's both a result of the job you do and the result of your personality. Most of us, even the famous Bill Campbell, came to his teaching role later in life. I first knew Bill when he was at Claris. He was a heads down manager. Great guy and all that, but but wasn't running around helping everybody else. He was trying to help his job. So that's what, again, back to Silicon Valley, that's what the VCs can do for us, that's what the lawyers do for us. They travel between companies and without divulging things, tell us what the best of the best do.
So do you think there's been any decline in that standard of integrity or ethos?
No, I think it's increased,
You do?
actually, yeah. I think the leaders of Silicon Valley hold themselves to a high standard. And, I think we've been through some times when, Silicon Valley wasn't at its best, and I think people have learned from that. And, there's a high level of commitment to doing the right thing to customers, for employees, for shareholders. I'm impressed by the leaders that I work with today. They're really true to that mission.
That's great to hear. So you all are our inspiration. I'm curious, who is your inspiration? In other words, who should be seated up here next year? Who is defying gravity? Sorry, I didn't prep them with that one.
Well, I don't have that answer, but I do want to answer who is my inspiration. My mom died when I was 8. I was raised by my grandmother. And one day, my little brother and I saw a rattlesnake up in the rafters in our machine shed in the farm in Wisconsin. So I ran and got Grandma and said, "There's a rattlesnake." So she came out, took a shovel, pushed it down, chopped its head off, and said, "Next time you can do that." That's a fact. I showed you how to do it, now you can do it, and don't come running. And so there's got to be people like that out there.
Ken? Gordy? Can you beat that? Either your inspiration or somebody you think is particularly inspiring today in Silicon Valley.
Well, I wasn't going to answer it that way either, but I'll try to think of it. But something that John Doerr said about Andy Grove struck me, which is grandchildren. Carolyn and I have 4 wonderful young grandchildren, and they're inspiring because of their inquisitiveness, their creativity, their ability to use an iPhone more facilely than I can at age 2. They can find exactly the videos they want to see and punch the right button. And they are. It's the young people that are growing up in this environment are going to be more creative and more inspired to do things than I think any prior generation.
Do you think there's a downside to that technology native
for sure,
obsession?
for sure, there's a risk. But if they use it as a base to be creative, which is the key. I think our parents worried about whether there was a downside to watching television, and I think there's a great interactive learning opportunity with modern technology that I think can expand the minds and, as I said, the creative talents of some of the young kids.
Okay.
I'm going to cheat a little bit and I'm going to embarrass somebody in the room here. I'm going to talk about why I'm so excited about the future. What's been fascinating to me is, as an old guy, actually I have a pretty good time working with younger people, and they somehow relate to me. But Ben Silverman at Pinterest, there's a couple of things about him that give me hope for the future about our future leaders, and so I know he's embarrassed. But one is, there are a lot of brilliant people in Silicon Valley, but there aren't a lot of brilliant people who are very self-aware. and he's incredibly self-aware, and that being self-aware allows him to confront his weaknesses and to grow enormously. And the second thing about him, there's a lot of talk about diversity here in the Valley, and in some ways I'm worried that it becomes a PR deal. He lives it and believes that he can build a great company, a greater company, if he's got lots of women and lots of people who are different. And that gives me great hope for the future of this place, when young leaders can think that way and approach building a company that way. So.
Great. We had lunches the past 2 days. One was, today was Innovators of Color, and yesterday was celebrating women in tech. So I think there is a lot of hope. I think things are changing, and not fast enough, but thank you for what you're doing, Ben. If you were to teach one class to entrepreneurs, what would it be? You can answer it either what you're gifted to teach or what you think entrepreneurs most need to learn.
Well, common wisdom has never been right in this valley, and you look 3 to 5 years in the future, so don't buy into common wisdom. It's just never been right.
So your class would be how to not buy into common
gotta,
wisdom? I want to take
gotta,
that.
You just, this is not an industry that just following the crowd will give you the victory. And you got to be willing to take risk and view the world differently than most people around you want to view the world.
I agree with that. I think that the foundation, though, is how to deal with people. And I think we get caught up in some of these technology dreams, and we get caught up in, thank God we do, augmented reality and what have you, but it comes basically down to, do you know how to deal with people, and are you willing to learn and be better and better and better with people? And that would be my class, and I have no clue how I teach it, but the biggest mistakes, frankly, in a lot of these companies is just how they burn through people and don't understand when to hire, when to fire, how to coach, when to listen. And I think if we could just get a little more of that going, it would help a lot of things.
I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach it, but I've learned a little bit about it lately. The course I would like to see entrepreneurs taking is design thinking. There's a course at the Stanford D School. I know many of the people in the room are familiar with it. But it can be applied to anything. It's applied to solving legal problems, access to legal services for underserved communities, for example. But it's the methodology of attacking a problem, which begins with empathy, understanding what the problem is, kind of walking in the shoes of the person who has a need. Then defining the problem, then ideating, which is a great word, and then coming up with a prototype, and then testing it, and then continuing to refine the prototype until you get a solution. And I think that again, it can be certainly applied to designing any product, but it can be applied to designing even social problems.
I've started a program here called Reboot to get women back into the workforce, and we teach design thinking to these women as a way of reframing their careers and how to think about the future differently. So I totally agree with you. Over the past 2 days, we've heard from people transforming all areas of humanity here, from transportation to communication to healthcare, entertainment. I'm curious, what new technology do you believe will have the most meaningful impact on society going forward? Is there one that you can cite?
I think Carol mentioned one of them, which is artificial intelligence in its broadest sense. It's being applied today in autonomous vehicles, but it's going to apply to everything. It's being applied in law now. You know, lawyers may be disintermediated very soon, but it has implications and applications in life sciences. You know, doing big data analytics. I think that there's a phenomenally inspiring company I'm working with now called Grail, whose mission is to detect cancer at an early stage while it can still be treated. And it's partly a genetic and sequencing problem. It's partly a big data problem. And using artificial intelligence and analytical techniques, you know, their mission is to detect cancer while it can be treated. I think that'll have a big impact.
You know, I got my degree in '71, and there were 3 things you could focus on as a computer science person. One was AI. So, just going back to '71, where we thought artificial intelligence was going to just be hot. I agree with you. I just think it's another step along the way.
Yeah, I think we'll see enormous strides in healthcare, and all the way from pharmaceuticals and the creation of drugs through the whole delivery system. I think it's going to create another issue for society, but I think people are going to live longer and be healthier, and it creates another set of issues that we'll see what society.
Yeah, bad knees.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, Nikesh Arora was here speaking tonight, and the advice he gave young entrepreneurs was, life is a set of experiences and not a destination, and take as much risk as you can. I'm curious, what advice would you give the entrepreneurs in the room, and perhaps what would you give to your 25-year-old self?
I agree with taking risk, but manage it. But the advice I'd give to my 25-year-old self is be humble.
I don't think 25-year-olds want any advice.
That's why they need to be
And
humble.
you have a few, right?
I have a few of those. I mean, they went through that 25 stage. They weren't very interested, actually. So I don't think I would have been very interested. And I think that's okay. I think that's, because all we'll do is stifle them. Because you're a little more afraid to do this, you're a little more afraid to do that, and some physically and some mentally. And so I think, you know, it's almost like when you have children, you just got to keep them inside the rails. You know, you don't have to keep them on a rail. You just have to keep them inside some boundaries. And again, I think that's something Silicon Valley is pretty famous for, again, with a lot of partnerships between types of organizations to stay between the rails. So I think advice I would give is that pick some advices you will listen to. Don't just cut everything out, because I think young people go through a period of time where they just cut any advice out, except their peers, and that's part of their natural process. But step back and think for a little bit about whether what that person said might make some sense to you, and then follow up with that.
I would say don't be afraid. You know, even though I went to 3 early stage companies and started a company, I still would be more risk oriented. You know, I like Carol Sandburg's statement, what would you do if you were not afraid? So the ability to confront your fears, to me, if I lived my life over, I would have probably been more aggressively confronting my fears.
Great advice. One last question before we close. Any reflections on Andy Grove?
I had the opportunity to testify in front of a Senate committee with Andy. And it was on technology, and there were 3 of us. I cannot remember who the third person was. And we were waiting outside to enter, and all the handlers are trying to give us advice. And so here's this mad Hungarian and this farm girl from Wisconsin, and we're talking about technology in front of the Senate. This was many years ago. It was surreal. But he had them eating out of his hands. I mean, he was just magical in a situation where, and we've all seen these on TV, if you haven't had a chance to do such a great thing as to testify in front of the Senate. He was absolutely magical, and I will always remember that.
I think what he did after he built Intel, to me, is instructive in that, you know, you walk this journey, you know, and you keep, and there's more to it than a job and a title and a lot of money to life. And I think that's what I think about him when I think of him, and I think of the people in this crowd, this audience. Just remember, there's a lot of life after you build your great company or have this great career. And when you look back on your life, you know, what did you really accomplish that mattered?
I never had the privilege of working with Andy, but I worked with many of his proteges, and I think you know, his legacy lives on in the people he mentored and trained, and the leaders that continued on at Intel and left Intel and started other companies. He was an idol that I had never met, but I certainly admired what he did, and both at Intel and, as Ken said, you know, later.
I do have one final question for Ken. 2 themes emerged in your interviews that we had. One is you're quite hot on the dance floor. We're not going to make you dance. The other is your love for the grape. So I'm curious, what wine will you be drinking to celebrate your induction into the Global Silicon Valley Hall of Fame?
How about a Domaine Romney Conti 1996 Latache?
Let's do it. Thank you very much. That sounds delicious.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.